Jamel, you cut out. We're not hearing you.
Oh yes, I'm still on here. I was just trying to get the presentation going, but just a couple of housekeeping rules. If you could mute your phones while the presentation is commencing, and also for all questions, we ask that you submit them via the chat functionality in the GoToMeetings web browser. During the presentations, all participants will be in silent mode, and this webinar will be recorded. And I would like to turn it over to Mr. Rick.
Okay. Bill, can you hear me? Okay, here we go.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, hi. I'm Rick Wice, incoming chair of the Environmental Community Semi-Environmental Community of Interest, and I'll be making a few opening remarks right now. The mission of the Environmental Community of Interest is to create value to the membership of SAMI through educational opportunities, professional forums, outreach, and business programs. The environmental COI is focused on the collaboration of SAMI members and government staff working on environmental issues. If you're a member of SAMI interested in participating in the environmental COI, you may join by following the instructions on the SAMI webpage, which is sami.org. We hope today's webinar is useful for your career and you find it interesting. Following the webinar, the presentation will be available on the SAMI Environmental COI webpage along with a video link to folks who may have missed it if you pass on the information to them. A certificate will be sent to those registered for the webinar. In the event you are viewing in a conference room setting, please email the list of attendees requiring certificates to Bella Fabrero. Actually, if you email it to Rick Wice, I'll make sure she gets it because I don't see the email information up here for her. So the webinar today would not be possible without our presenters. So I'd like to sincerely thank all of them for their participation. I'd also like to thank each of you for joining us today. As noted by the webinar title, the goals of today's presentations is to provide an update on 1,4-dioxane occurrence, fate, regulatory issues, and treatment technologies. The webinar will consist of 3 20-minute presentations, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session after the presentations. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Janet Anderson. She has experience providing toxicological and risk management strategies to federal agencies, private industry, and municipal clients. She also provides litigation consulting and expert services and is a diplomat at the American Board of Toxicology. Dr. Anderson is a recognized leader in emerging contaminants such as PFAS, 1,4-dioxane, 1,2,3-trichloropropane. She is also an invited speaker and panelist at scientific conferences, regulatory and industry meetings, and many workshops and webinars. Dr. Anderson received her PhD in molecular and cancer biology from the University of Cincinnati, completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and led the U.S. Air Force's Emerging Contaminant Program. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Janet Anderson to present 1,4-dioxane toxicology and regulation.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Let's see if I have control over the slides yet. Let me advance the slide. Not sure if it's working for me yet. All right. So I'm going to kick off our discussion today on 1,4-dioxane and present a little bit about the underlying toxicology that forms the basis of our risk-based decisions and regulations in this area, and then provide an overview on the different regulations that we see across different state and federal and some international entities, and discuss why there's some differences. So with that, let's just see. A little bit of the background, since I'm the kickoff speaker here, I wanted to set the stage for a timeline of events with regard to 1,4-dioxane. It's a chemical that's been around for decades in industrial use and production, largely as a solvent stabilizer. And as the use of solvent stabilizers, mainly 1,1,1-TCA, has declined, so has the use in manufacturing and industry of 1,4-dioxane also declined. However, we do see it also as a byproduct of some ethoxylation. So therefore, it's also present in a whole bunch of, could be present in personal care products like soaps and detergents and those kinds of things. So you may see it referenced in that context as well. With regard to, though, attention from a regulatory perspective and a toxicology perspective, that work really didn't begin until the early 2000s. In 2008, 1,4-dioxane was first listed on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Safe Drinking Water Act Candidate Contaminant List, that's CCL. Now, the CCL is EPA's Office of Water's indication that they're interested in looking at a chemical for its occurrence in our nation's drinking water and consideration for developing an MCL. To date, we don't have a federal MCL, so the process has not, EPA has not gone through the formal MCL process for 1,4-dioxane. But since 2008, it's been listed as a potential concern and has been evaluated from federal agencies and also many states. The first toxicity information, or I guess the most recent toxicity information from the federal government, was issued in 2010 and then finalized in 2013 from EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, or their IRIS program. So we've had toxicity values to assess risk since 2010, really, from an oral ingestion and oral exposure pathway. And that also directly fed into EPA issuing a health advisory for drinking water. So we do have a drinking water health advisory, which is a non-binding, non-promulgated, just a guidance number to help guide drinking water supply systems and risk management for drinking water supplies across the country. There's been testing, as Dave's going to talk through some of the data related to occurrence testing of 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. That's under the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule 3, and that occurred from 2013 to 2014, or 2015 actually. And most recently, from a federal perspective, a lot of the regulatory attention is related to 1,4-dioxane under the TSCA program, our Toxic Substances and Control Act. So under that program, EPA has issued a draft risk evaluation and some draft documentation about that as well. So why? What is the concern? What do we know about the toxicology of 1,4-dioxane? From looking at the database, it's actually pretty a standard database for industrial chemicals. We've got really just a few epidemiology studies. These are studies that have looked at human exposure from an occupational scenario. We have no population-wide studies of exposures to the general population from 1,4-dioxane. But the few occupational studies are really limited and really quite old and really poor exposure, if any, exposure information. So those studies aren't very helpful for us when we're trying to understand potential risks to the general population related to 1,4-dioxane in the environment or in personal care products or any kind of the places where we might be exposed. So we rely on the animal studies, and there's a good database of animal toxicity studies related to 1,4-dioxane. They largely show that there's toxicity in the kidneys and the liver of animals that have ingested contaminated water. And the largest and most consistent concern is cancer. So several entities, both the international agencies plus EPA and our National Toxicology Program, have all identified 1,4-dioxane as, possibly carcinogenic or likely to be carcinogenic. And those classifications really are because we don't actually have the human data to show it. But in the animals, it's pretty clear that 1,4-dioxane is likely to cause cancer if exposed at long enough duration and high enough exposure. So the bottom line is the cancer risks drive our regulatory action and our concern for this chemical. And unlike some of the other emerging contaminants that we deal with, such as perfluorinated compounds, there's not a lot of controversy over that. It's pretty well established. In fact, I don't know anyone who would disagree that it's the cancer risks for 1,4-dioxane that are driving the concern. However, how we then interpret the cancer risk into screening levels or regulatory numbers, there is quite a large difference. So here is a map that's actually from the ITRC fact sheet that'll be soon available on the website, that shows within the US the range of different either groundwater or drinking water. And some of these numbers here are just screening levels. Some of them are actually promulgated numbers. If we take an international look, though, what's really interesting is that the Health Canada actually is one of the most recent full comprehensive toxicology evaluations and derivation of number. And they have a maximal acceptable concentration proposed back in 2018 of 50 micrograms per liter, or 50 parts per billion. And then shown here, you can see the different US numbers. So just for example, the US drinking water, its health advisory, again, just a guidance value is at 35. The tap water screening level that we would use if we've got groundwater contaminated at a site, for example, is set at 0.46. And some of the states have screening levels or promulgated standards. So I chose to highlight here Colorado's, because Colorado is one of the first states to promulgate a standard for groundwater cleanup. There's a set at 0.35. And so what's important is the takeaway is that the values for 1,4-dioxane in groundwater and drinking water actually do range quite a bit, all the way from 0.3 all the way up to 50 micrograms per liter or parts per billion. So why? Why do we have this variability? As I said, everyone pretty much agrees that this is a carcinogen or a potential carcinogen, and we want to protect against human cancer risk. Well, the reality is that toxicology is not a very precise science. So in order to come up with that bottom threshold value that, represented in the circle in orange here, a whole bunch of choices have to be made in understanding what or how to derive that number. And for 1,4-dioxane, we have different opinions on the science, both from a science perspective and also a science policy perspective, on how to extrapolate and do a dose response and how to think about our exposures. And simply those differences in those two buckets, so to speak, can result in different quantitative interpretations of the threshold value. So importantly, I want you to know that toxicology is not a precise science. You would never ask a toxicologist to build you a bridge, because we like to divide things by 10. We like to talk about things within an order of magnitude certainty. And there's both science and policy decisions that can impact the quantitative derivation of that number. So to dive a little bit deeper, to think about why are some of the state values and the EPA RSL, the regional screening level, lower than the health advisory, for example, for drinking water, that simply comes down to a policy decision about the cancer risk range. You may have heard of this concept before, where we assess carcinogens based on the probability of extra risk, and we, as a policy nationwide, set values that either result in a 1 in a million or 1 in 10,000 extra risk above background. These are policy decisions. That doesn't mean that we're accepting one person can get cancer. It's more a statistical evaluation of where you could actually detect a risk. And the health advisories set by EPA for carcinogens are set at the 10 to the minus 4 level, which for 1,4-dioxane equates to 35 parts per billion. But our groundwater screening levels that we use in cleanup type programs, and for example, what Colorado used, we typically start at the lower end, or the 10 to the minus 6 level. So it's simply an 100-fold difference based on a policy decision for cancer risk. So different assumptions about the cancer risk and how exposures to those chemicals, to the carcinogens may occur, can slightly change, well, can change by 100-fold your interpretation of what that threshold level can be. So when you see a number for a health advisory at 35, and then you see someone else at 3.5, someone else at 0.35, those just simply represent for 1,4-dioxane different cancer risk levels. But as I mentioned earlier, we also have Health Canada that came out with a screening level, or actually they're promulgated
What happened?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not hearing Janet. I think we might have lost the audio.
Also, I have no way to get control of the slides, so when I need to have them done, I can't. We lost.
Yeah, it's not. It still says she's talking, but there's no actual physical audio coming from her mic. So, do you guys want to continue?
I think we
Well,
should give
Dave,
her, I think
yeah,
we should
give her a
give
few
her
minutes.
a second to try to call back in. I can send her a note.
Okay, everyone just wait 1 minute. Patience would be appreciated.
I guess, Tamel, if you can reiterate the comment process for people. Questions?
Yes, so if you have any questions of what's going on or what's being discussed, if you can do it through the chat functionality, there's a message bubble on your web at GoToMeetings browser. And all questions will be answered towards the end of the presentation.
However, I suppose if anybody has a question right now, perhaps one of the rest of us could answer it.
We're trying to get Dr. Anderson back on the line. We'll wait just a few minutes. Please be patient.
And Tamel, there's a comment or a question about copies of the slides. What's the process on that?
Yes, if you have registered for, went through the registration process, there will be a PDF copy of the presentations. It will be sent after the presentation is concluded.
Janet says she is listening in and still on the audio. Can you
Is she
unmute
muted?
her?
Tamel, can you double check, make sure she's not muted?
Yes, let me see. Janet, do you know which caller your number is, like caller 8 or which one specifically? And I'll be able to unmute you and then change your name.
You might have to unmute everybody and have her talk.
Yeah, pardon me. Let me go through the caller list.
And while they're doing that, the question that somebody else tossed in there is about states being sued for setting different standards than or higher standards with respect to drinking water. You know, I'm not aware of any lawsuits specifically related to that, related to standard setting. I think when there isn't a federal level standard, then states kind of can do whatever they want, and using PFAS as an example of where states are setting everything from 5 parts per trillion to higher numbers. It seems like as long as the state has some rationale and follows their state procedure, they can set standards however they like, as long as there's some basis for it.
Dr. Anderson dialed back in. Perhaps we just have to unmute everybody and ask them to please mute their individual phones so we can bring her back on board.
Yes, if everyone can mute their phones and monitors and computers, I will unmute everyone and then we will know which one Dr. Janet is.
Hello. Oh, all kinds of background noise though.
Yeah, please everybody mute.
Oh, it's at the bottom this whole time.
She might be caller 20.
Yeah, I think she
Can you
is.
hear me?
Makes sense.
Hello? Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes, we
Oh
are.
my
We
goodness.
got you back on. Sorry about that.
That's crazy. I don't know what
idea
happened. I could hear you guys the whole time. The whole time I was talking and I could hear you guys lost my audio, but I could hear you. I don't know. Okay, well, let's jump in and I'll catch up because I don't want to take time away from my colleagues.
Yes, do you still have control of the presentation?
No.
Oh, no.
Do I? No, I don't. If you could give that back to me, that'd be great.
No problem. Oh, you still have control.
Okay, so maybe. Okay. The point on Health Canada, let me just jump to that one. No, I still don't think I have control. Is their higher number, the 50 part per billion, is just based on newer information and different interpretation of the science. So 1,4-dioxane is an emerging contaminant because a lot of information or attention for 1,4-dioxane has been coming out of the academic studies, research, not only on the toxicology, but fate and transport and remediation and all that. So new information was evaluated by Health Canada when they did their consideration of setting a screening level. And I still don't think I have control over the slides because it won't advance for me. If we could go to the next slide, please.
Okay.
I don't think I have control. So I will, I'll skip through the technical detail of this whenever you can see the next slide, but the point is that different interpretations of how exactly 1,4-dioxane might cause cancer leads to two different quantitative numbers of how to set a threshold. Are we not able to advance the slides now either? Should I just start talking? I don't know if someone's advancing the slides or not.
No. Tamel, can you advance the slide just to, so she can talk to it?
Yeah.
Okay, keep just advance. We'll just go to the next section because I want to get through this so that you guys.
There we go. We have advanced. We have advanced. How does it cause cancer? Okay. Slide 13.
All right. So just simply how interpretations, the different interpretations of how 1,4-dioxane might cause cancer can lead to a different evaluation quantitatively. And so that's the bottom line. And so what you might see are then some of the more recent states have considered, while they still are using the US EPA evaluation of the cancer and the default assumptions that EPA has made, they're allowing for a slightly higher risk management level. So some of the most recent numbers that have come out of states such as Michigan and Alaska, for example, have set their screening levels or cleanup numbers at the 10 to the -5. So a little bit less stringent. That's the most important thing. So what I want to convey to this group is to remember that if you are in a situation where, say, you're doing a cleanup of a site and you're not in a scenario where there's actually a promulgated required standard, so not in Colorado, for example, so somewhere where you've got a to be considered risk consideration, keep in mind the cancer risk range and keep in mind that there are good information to support a higher number. And ultimately, that number matters. So this slide is some data that Dave's going to walk through later. But what is shown in just the box and whisker plots here is just some of the US drinking water data. And I've drawn red lines at where those top numbers, where Health Canada at 50 and EPA's health advisory is actually some of the higher numbers in parts per billion. And you can see that those are at the upper end, if not above, where we see occurrence information, the concentration of 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. And in groundwater, the same thing is true. So this is information shown here for the US Air Force, detections of 1,4-dioxane in groundwater, both at plants and their installations. And again, if you impose where that drinking water or where our screening levels, if you use a 10 to the -4 or use Health Canada's number, many of the detections fall below those, so would essentially not be of concern or risk to human health. Okay, so I'll wrap it up here. 1,4-dioxane is a likely human carcinogen, but it's based on rodent data. And so interpreting how that information applies to humans is why there's some differences in the from the regulatory numbers. And the current standards, they do range from 0.3 to 50. So what we're watching for in the future is continue to watch as the states move ahead. In the absence of a federal MCL, as states promulgate their own MCLs or come up with their own guidance values for either drinking water or screening level. Currently, the only evaluation for 1,4-dioxane is happening under the TSCA program, but with the reformulation and reinstitution of how TSCA is executed, there could be wide-reaching impacts for that. There's a lot of research, not only on the mode of action or how 1,4-dioxane causes cancer, but also just on fate and transport remediation technologies, and a lot of research coming out on this chemical. And I also want to say that if we turn forward to not just thinking about human health risks, but ecological risks, there is also some concerns about aquatic toxicity. And so therefore, things like surface water quality standards could actually then become a driver of some sites. So I will wrap it up. Sorry about the debacle there with the technical difficulties, but I'll turn it back over to my colleagues. Happy to answer any questions later as well.
Okay, hey, thank you, Janet. And once again, sorry, folks, for a little bit of the audio glitch there. We hope that we'll overcome that. And once again, we'll take, if you have chat questions, please enter them on the chat page. I'd like to now introduce our second speaker here. It's Dr. David Adamson with GSI. Dave has environmental project experience in academic research and environmental consulting, and he's a professional engineer in Texas. He has worked as postdoctoral research associate at Cornell, and he's held lecturer, research scientist, and adjunct assistant professor positions at Rice University and the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. Dr. Addison has expertise dealing with natural attenuation, source zone characterization, emerging contaminants, matrix diffusion, and innovative treatment technologies. He served as a principal investigator in several DoD research projects addressing 1,4-dioxane, long-term strategies, enhanced amendment delivery, and improved characterization and treatment of contaminants in low permeability building matrices. With that, I turn it over to Dr. Dave Addison, who's going to discuss 1,4-dioxane, fate, and transport.
Well, thanks, Rick. This is Dave. I'm going to see if I have control over the slides here. It looks like I do. Let me make sure that this actually advances. There we go. Okay. Well, so I'm focusing mostly in my time here on fate and transport, and you can't talk about fate and transport without showing a cartoon. So that's what we've got here on this first slide. Really basic cartoon, essentially looking at a conceptual model for 1,4-dioxane once we get into groundwater, with a couple processes highlighted on here that you might consider relevant or maybe not relevant for a 1,4-dioxane. So not much retention in the soil. Not a lot of potential for volatilization, but once you get into the groundwater, because it doesn't sorbate very strongly, it is potentially subject to really rapid migration. In the past few years, we've done a lot of research essentially on helping us improve how you develop these type of conceptual models for sites with 1,4-dioxane as well as co-occurring chlorinated solvents. And so that's really helped us sort of address the two questions that are laid out on there, and that's what I'm going to spend my time on, is thinking about things like question number one: what's the nature of 1,4-dioxane sources? So meaning, like, where does it come from? How does it get into the subsurface? Is it widely occurring? What media do we have to worry about, and what kinds of concentrations we see? And then secondly is thinking about what happens to 1,4-dioxane over time after it's been released. And these are important questions for us. These are really the things that help us understand how we're going to evaluate risk, and then ultimately how we might think about treatment or remediation, which Bill will talk about later. Okay, and Janet talked a little bit about this in terms of thinking about sources, and we spend a lot of time talking about industrial sources of 1,4-D, releases that are associated with vapor degreasing. And that makes sense. A lot of those sites are really the ones that are likely to find their way into cleanup programs, and they're the ones that we have to figure out how to remediate. But this graphic, I want to highlight at least the potential impact of non-industrial sources of 1,4-dioxane. And Janet mentioned this. This is stuff like shampoo or detergents or cosmetic products, other household type of things that contain 1,4-dioxane as an unwanted byproduct from the manufacturing process. So these go down the drain, and then when you're talking about how it can get then into the subsurface, well, you've got things like, leaky sewer lines there shown on the left, or you've got maybe even septic effluent where 1,4-dioxane might be poorly treated. The key point is that these sources then end up releasing dioxane across a relatively large area. So you can sort of think of them as diffuse sources. They end up being harder to pinpoint, present a whole different set of challenges in terms of source control to prevent exposures. And then the other important point on there is sort of thinking about these is that we're not really necessarily just thinking about a contaminated industrial site. You've got things like landfills or wastewater treatment plants. They end up being part of the story as well. So Janet alluded to this earlier, but we do have a bunch of data in terms of thinking about occurrence of 1,4-dioxane. So as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, US EPA is supposed to gather occurrence data in order to understand whether we should set MCLs. So for 1,4-dioxane, they have included this in the UCMR3, the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, third round that occurred 2013 to 2015. So this graphic that's shown on here is essentially all those public water systems. Each dot is an individual public water system, and the results that they got when they collected samples for 1,4-dioxane. And so essentially any of the darker gray dots, those are public water systems where at least one of those samples was above a method reporting limit, but below a reference concentration. And any of those red dots are then systems where they saw it above that reference concentration. So EPA in this case, that reference concentration was the 0.35 micrograms per liter that Janet had talked about earlier. So what this ends up being is that 21% of all those public water systems saw at least one sample where they detected that dioxane. And at 7% of those public water systems, they had one of those samples that were above that 10 to the minus 6 cancer-based reference concentration. So it ends up being a lot of systems that are potentially impacted by 1,4-dioxane. And, we deal a lot with PFAS as well in terms of thinking about it in drinking water. These numbers are definitely higher than what we see for PFAS, despite all the attention that's paid to those compounds. So on the next slide, we're essentially then showing a breakdown of some of the distribution of that. So let's think about what sort of factors affected whether we saw 1,4-dioxane and then at what concentrations we saw it at. The takeaway on this is that concentration really does matter, as Janet mentioned before, when we think about comparing these to various thresholds that have been proposed. So this is essentially concentration on that left-hand y-axis, and then the box and whisker diagrams are showing sort of the distribution of concentrations in the samples where they saw 1,4-dioxane detected. So on those left two boxes, you're essentially showing the impact of system size. And so this really is a sense where the large systems, the systems that are serving 10,000 or more people, that's where you see higher detection frequencies. So in this case, about 12% of all samples. And you see slightly higher concentrations as well relative to sort of those smaller systems, those ones that are serving below 10,000. There's the right-hand two boxes then are thinking about where that water came from, that public water system is supplying their water. So either groundwater or surface water. In this case, concentration slightly higher in groundwater, but not too much higher. The detection frequencies, again, relatively similar. So we tend to think about 1,4-dioxane in contaminated sites and impacting groundwater. But the important point is that don't really forget about those potential surface water sources, either direct or indirect discharge into those surface waters. That's been implicated as sources in the US. There's several great studies that came out of Germany where they've sort of talked about that as well in terms of where we see 1,4-dioxane in our drinking water. When we focus then on cleanup sites, we're really thinking about 1,4-dioxane in the context of what it occurs with. So co-occurring, and a large part of the story is, again, there are these household products that are potential sources, but many of the 1,4-dioxane sites that are in the cleanup programs are really also chlorinated solvent sites. So what this graphic is trying to show is essentially data that's been collected then from the California GeoTracker database. It provides us the ability to see what's happening across a larger number of sites. So that graphic, these are 786, that top bubble there, 786 where dioxane has been analyzed as part of their monitoring program. They saw dioxane at 314 of those sites, so just under half of them. And then the smaller bubbles at the bottom of there are showing then what they saw in terms of co-occurring fluorinated solvents. So 174 TCA, 174 of those 714 sites had TCA, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing co-occurrence ratios of somewhere on the order of 52 to 93% of these chlorinated solvents with 1,4-dioxane. The highest one is actually TCE, not TCA, and that is related to the fact that a lot of these sites the TCA is already gone, and it's also then the fact that TCE is a really widely occurring compound used at almost all chlorinated solvent sites, so it shows up readily as well. Another way to think about co-occurrence data is look at the extent to which we're failing to even identify a 1,4-dioxane site. So this slide has a lot of information on it. It's based on a slightly older evaluation, so the number of sites don't necessarily quite match up with those on the previous slide, but it works for illustrative purposes. And if you just focus on that left-hand side for now, with the bubbles representing sites where TCE is analyzed. So that big bubble shows that TCE was detected at 2,865 sites, and that at 273 of those sites we saw 1,4-dioxane. 218 there was no 1,4-dioxane. They looked for it, but they couldn't find it. And that means they basically found it at 56% of the sites. But the really big bubble on there, the big yellow bubble that's shaded there, is essentially there's 2,374 sites, the vast majority of them, where they didn't bother to analyze for dioxane at all. So for these three different compounds, we're talking about ranges of 62 to 83% of those sites where they really didn't even go about trying to attempt to see whether dioxane was present. And given what we know about co-occurrence, what we saw in the previous slide, this essentially means that there's likely hundreds, if not thousands, of these sites out there that really have yet to be sort of investigated for 1,4-dioxane. Another problem then becomes thinking about how we go about analyzing for 1,4-dioxane in these aqueous samples. So if you're sort of thinking back to those 787 sites with 1,4-dioxane analysis, if you sort of break those down, again, we have about 314 sites with detections, 472 sites without any samples that were detected. There's a real big difference in terms of how those samples were analyzed. So the ones where they actually detected it, the bubble on the left there, they were using methods, primarily 8270-based methods that had much lower reporting limits. So we're talking about things where reporting limit, the median was on the order of 2 micrograms per liter, and they were detecting low-level concentrations. So of all the detections, the medians were around 12 micrograms per liter. On the right-hand side, those sites where they said, well, we don't think there's any dioxane, it's really a reporting limit issue. So the median reporting limit on those was much, much higher. It was on the order of 57 if we're just looking at the median. And the breakdown then of the methods that were used are shown in those next level of bubbles. So it shows that primarily what we're talking about on the sites where they've detected 1,4-dioxane, they've used the semi-volatile method, the 8270 method, and that's afforded them lower reporting limits. And at the sites on sort of right branch, those are the sites where they say there's no dioxane there. It's normally these methods, these sites that they've used or relied on 8260 instead of 8270. So they're using the volatile method, maybe at the same time as they're trying to analyze for CVOCs and thus not getting the reporting limits that they're needing to get. So it's those sites that sort of represent the ones that may have been misidentified. We've got the analytical methods, the lack of sensitivity driving that lack of identification. So how important is this? Well, it turns out it's really important when we look at the type of concentrations that we see at these sites. And Janet showed a portion of this graph earlier, but it highlights the nature of how dilute these 1,4-dioxane sites are. So those first two box and whiskers are showing from the primarily Air Force and other military installations. The box on the darker box on the right-hand side of that graphic is showing from a combination of commercial industrial sites. But what we're really seeing is that these sites generally have relatively low concentrations of 1,4-dioxane currently. That's an issue, as Janet mentioned, in terms of thinking about whether we're in compliance or not with any potential regulatory criteria, but also makes it really difficult in terms of identifying these sites. So we need to think really closely about getting selecting the right methods in order to sort of identify them. Okay, so that was sort of thinking about that first question. And now the second question is more, what happens to 1,4-dioxane over time after it's been released? What are the relevant processes that we need to worry about? How does this affect sort of the extent of contamination in terms of plume size? And then what happens in terms of things like attenuation or matrix effects and so forth. So we can use some of those same multi-site data that we've collected and sort of take a look at the plume size question. And this is data that we published before, but this is essentially saying, okay, do the data suggest that these 1,4-dioxane plumes are racing out ahead of the chlorinated solvent sites? So we gathered data on 105 sites, and what we essentially saw is that really that conceptual site model was only true at about 21% of the sites. At another 23% of the sites, we saw that the dioxane and chlorinated solvent plumes were actually relatively similar in size. And really the majority of the sites, at 56% of the sites in this particular set of data, the chlorinated solvent plume itself was actually the longer one. And so you ask yourself, the question is well, why don't plume sizes fit the sort of conventional assumptions about 1,4-dioxane? Some of it's presumably due to natural attenuation, or some of these sites had pump and treat systems in place that are used to control plume size. But it's also valuable to sort of think about how chlorinated solvents were used over time at a variety of sites, as well as sort of their own transport characteristics, and that's what's shown on the next slide. So we set up sort of a hypothetical example where we're releasing TCE and 111 TCA at one site, but not necessarily at the same time. So TCE was generally used, much earlier than TCA. So in this case, think about if it was a 1955 release, and that TCE, some of that portion of that was being converted, and in this case, we'll show for 11 DCE. And then at the same site, we'll show for 1970 release when TCA began to be largely replacing TCE, and then some of the products associated with that, as well as 1,4-dioxane then, which was used again as a stabilizer for that solvent. So we've set sort of a range of R values on here based on some assumptions about the fraction of organic carbon, so relatively default values. And if you look at those R values, just off, taking at face value, you see that really the R for 1,4-dioxane, which in most cases is just 1, it's expected to move relatively similar velocity as groundwater. Some of these other chlorinated solvents, the R's are not much different. So if you then take the travel distance over a period of time, so let's project things out to 2020, for that original 1955 release, this is what you'd expect to see for TCE, and if 11 DCE was generated relatively quickly, you'd see those things out to about 1,300 feet. So if you came along then in 1970 and then mapped out the release of these other compounds, what you'd see is the extent of it sort of gets out there, but because of that head start that TCE had, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to see out in front of it. And these shaded areas are supposed to represent the range based on the different retardation factors. You'd sort of expect to see 1,4-dioxane sort of in that sort of a range expected with these other chlorinated solvents. So, this is a simple exercise, but it sort of demonstrates or brings home the fact that we would not necessarily expect to see really large 1,4-dioxane plumes relative to chlorinated solvents, even if we hadn't gone out and collected that data in the first place. Okay. So the next topic is attenuation, and again, we've collected a lot of data and sort of trying to look at this. We tended to think of 1,4-dioxane as sort of a recalcitrant compound, but there is evidence for attenuation at a lot of different sites. So what this chart is showing is essentially that concentrations of individual compounds were reduced over time. So we're expressing it as an reduction, an order of magnitude reduction, basically the ratio of the current concentration to the maximum concentration at that site. For TCA, these sites saw a 0.94 order of magnitude reduction, so almost a 1 order of magnitude reduction. That would be equivalent to about 90%. That's not too surprising. We know that compound's readily degradable. What ends up being interesting about this is you see dioxane in there, that's at about 0.59 ohms, that's about a 75% reduction. And that number is actually really similar to what we see with TCE, 1,1-DCE, and 1,1-DCA, and in fact, they're not really statistically significantly different. The only one that's really clearly attenuating faster is TCA. So these data sort of suggest that we are seeing reductions in concentration over time with dioxane. It's attenuating to a similar degree as a lot of the chlorinated solvents that it's present with. Another important factor then to think about is just looking at 1,4-dioxane is the effect of concentration. So this slide is showing a distribution of half-lives that were established for 1,4-dioxane at 131 wells at Air Force installations where 1,4-dioxane attenuation was able to be confirmed. This is data that Hunter Anderson put together. And what he's doing here is essentially showing the importance of 1,4-dioxane initial concentration by breaking these into sort of these quartile ranges. So the half-lives are broken into 4 equal quartiles that then show the range of concentrations that were associated with each set. So if you look at the one on the left, these are essentially the mean half-lives for the quarter of sites that had the lowest maximum concentrations, and it was between 1.2 and 4.6 micrograms per liter. In this case, lower half-lives are better, so we see good performance at the low concentration. But we see even better performance at high concentrations, that quartile on the far right, and the speculation is that these higher concentrations were in a more favorable range to support a wider range of organisms that can potentially degrade 1,4-dioxane. The second graph is showing sort of a similar study that was done. Marcio da Silva did this with a slightly different range of concentrations, but sort of seeing that as you sort of move into the higher concentrations, in this case, we're showing rate constants, so higher is better. You see the same sort of concentration effect, so evidence for faster attenuation rates at these high concentrations. So potentially implicating that we've got biological processes that might be responsible for some of the attenuation that we're seeing. One last fate and transport issue for 1,4-D that I'd like to highlight is the potential importance of matrix diffusion. So that's shown in this graphic where we've sort of placed a low K zone, maybe a clay aquitard below the aquifer. And when we talk about matrix diffusion, we're simply saying this process where mass diffuses into the different zones in response to some sort of a concentration gradient. So if you've got a lot of 1,4-dioxane here, then there's this driving force that pushes that 1,4-D into the low K zone. And once it's there, it's relatively immobile because of vective flow, not much of it going on in that low K zone. But one way it can be transported back out, it goes in the other direction once that source concentration is depleted, and that can sustain sort of these low-level concentrations within the aquifer for long periods of time. And this might be relevant at some sites with this type of geologic setting. We can use sort of modeling to help predict us how fast or how much or how important we think this might be. And that's what's shown on this next slide. So this is modeling data from a hypothetical release in 1970 of 1,4-dioxane and TCA. So dioxane's on the left there, and these panels are essentially showing the concentration within that low K zone itself. So y-axis is depth into the low K zone, and the x-axis is the lateral distance from that source. The red and the warmer colors they're representing relatively high concentrations, while the blue ones are the lower and non-detectable concentrations. And because 1,4-D has really high solubility, you see that in 1973, you've already got some of those sort of high concentrations already within that sort of source zone. If we fast forward to 2010, you see that 1,4-dioxane has really penetrated deeper into the low K zone, but it's also extended farther down gradient, and that's That's due to the fact that it can migrate relatively rapidly. So it's distributing those colors across a relatively large area. And this is even more pronounced when we fast forward then to 2050, 80 years after we started this release. So you've got extensive migration of 1,4-dioxane into that low K zone relative to TCA. So what does that mean for the aquifer concentrations? Well, this graph is essentially then showing on the y-axis the concentration of those two compounds that we'd expect to see back diffusing into the aquifer after the original source is gone. So 1,4-dioxane and TCA, they both start to plateau out, sort of looking at the 80-year concentrations that are out here. You see that, you know, you're sort of thinking about things in the 1 milligram or slightly lower level. And so these are pretty stout source zone concentrations just owing to the back diffusion process based on these sort of this hypothetical release. And it ends up becoming a pretty big issue for dioxane if we're thinking about regulatory levels that are way down here, that back diffusion might end up being the actual sort of true source for a lot of these sites after the original source has been depleted. Okay, well, one final slide here, and I think Bill is going to touch a little bit more on remediation options. But one of the things that some of these data on fate and transport highlight is that M&A, at least for 1,4-dioxane, might be a fairly viable strategy just because of the challenges associated with dealing with it with other more active methods. So we've got these things, these lines of evidence, such as evidence for attenuation at many, but not necessarily all sites. We've got a better understanding of 1,4-dioxane behavior, particularly things like the matrix diffusion effects that might control our ability to treat it. And then we've got better tools for going in and sort of determining whether 1,4-dioxane is actually, the plumes are stable. So all of these things sort of are working towards thinking about that as a potential option for managing these sites. Okay, well, that's all I had, and I'll turn it back over to Rick, I believe.
Yes, that's me. Yep, I really appreciate your presentation. And once again, if you have questions, please use our chat feature to get them online here so we get an answer for them. I'd like to introduce our last speaker. Our third speaker is Bill DiGuiseppi of Jacobs. He's a principal hydrogeologist with 30 years of applied experience in hundreds of soil and groundwater investigation and remediation sites. Bill is a professional geologist, and he is the leader of Jacobs' emerging contaminant community practice. In that role, Bill directs a team of professionals in the identification, prioritization, and management of chemicals such as PFAS, 1,4-dioxane, and 1,2,3-trichloropropane, some nanometals, and some other critical emerging contaminants. Bill has also published technical articles, chaired sessions at international conferences, and he co-authored a definitive book on 1,4-dioxane with Tom Moore. He is the vice chair of the emerging issues for the SAMI Community of Interest, and he's had leadership roles in several ITRC teams. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Bill, who will discuss 1,4-dioxane treatment.
All right. Thank you, Rick. I see the slides work. I would mention that a lot of this information, if you want more details, is found in the dioxane book that Rick mentioned, and the second edition has been published this month in January and is available through CRC Press. And it's not just Tom Moore as co-authors, but Janet Anderson helped contribute to the toxicology and risk sections, as well as Jim Hatton in a number of sections. So you can get more information in that arena. So I'm going to talk about remediation technologies overall. I'm going to jump right into soil treatment technologies, partly to dispense with that. As Dave's discussion pointed out, the retention in the vadosone of 1,4-dioxane is not really that high. We don't typically see really high concentrations in source areas in vadosone soils like we do with other less mobile contaminants because of the high miscibility and solubility of dioxane. So obviously typical approaches like dig and haul or capping could certainly be considered. Soil vapor extraction could be effective depending on the goals and the type of conditions, because As was also discussed, the miscibility of 1,4-dioxane is such that it wants to be found in the water, and if there's soil moisture, it will be in that soil moisture, and it's difficult to remove that. But in desert climates or other dry, low moisture areas, geologies, you might have soil vapor extraction might be effective. One version of soil vapor extraction that's been tested in a field pilot scale is extreme soil vapor extraction, some of Rob Hinchy's work under USDOD grants. In this case, warm air is being blown in on the outside of this little diagram, and then the air is drawn out in the middle, and the graph on the side shows the before and after concentrations with depth of 1,4-dioxane. So definitely removal did occur. It turns out that substantial soil moisture decrease occurred too, and much of the removal occurred after most of the soil moisture was removed. So again, it's a question of if the water's present, the dioxane wants to be in the water, and it's tough to remove from that water. So that's a soil treatment approach that may be viable in some cases. So now I'm going to launch into groundwater remediation technologies. I'll discuss a couple ex situ approaches and then in situ approaches. And so the first one is sorption. Granular activated carbon in general is not terribly effective, but it could be effective depending on your remedial objectives and the overall water quality. Removals of 50, 60, 70% are possible, and there are some specific carbons that are a little more effective than others. So that could be an option, but for low concentrations that we typically see and low cleanup goals, the volume of carbon necessary may or may not work. One particularly good application of carbon could be residential point of use or point of entry systems. If they're monitored and or carbon is changed out quarterly, an under sink filter type system or a whole house system could have carbon. It could do well enough in that circumstance and be easy to change out and not very complicated. There is a specific resin that has been developed by Dow and marketed by ECT2, Dow Ambrosorb 563. It's been demonstrated at a number of sites and really high removal rates. A wide range of concentrations have been tested with it, and it is a regenerable resin. So the resin isn't replaced, it's reactivated or regenerated periodically when full. So it can be cost competitive for the long term. And this diagram, I'm on slide 45, by the way. This diagram is of a resin absorption process. This particular diagram, the first set of vessels here on the left are for VOC removal. Different resins are needed, different sorbents are needed for that because the Ambrosorb is not terribly effective on chlorinated VOCs. But so you have a equalization tank and some bag filters on the way in, and then the Ambrosorb resin vessels are on the right. You have multiple vessels because when they reach saturation and you start to have breakthrough, you can switch to another vessel and steam regenerate the resin. So you flush steam through it, and you're pulling out the 1,4-dioxane with the steam, runs through a condenser, various separators, and then that high concentration, low volume liquid can be sorbed to GAC. Because again, in some circumstances, if you have high enough concentrations, the GAC could be effective for that. And then the water that goes through can be fed back to the front end of it. So this has been applied full scale, a number of sites, and is pretty well documented. Another ex situ technology is advanced oxidation. There are a number of commercially available products on the market that have been well demonstrated at quite a wide range of flow rates. This image here is one being installed at Air Force Plant 44, and inside that box is an ozone peroxide system that has about 90 linear feet of piping within that box to go 7 million gallons a day worth of treatment. Relatively high capital cost and can be a high O&M cost with UV peroxide. The UV lamps periodically burn out. The energy to drive the lamps can be high. They need cleaning periodically. With the ozone peroxide, you have an ozone generator. There's cost associated with that ozone generator. Those don't last forever either. but very good removals, and it's a destructive technology, so you're eliminating the liability on site for the most part. And it has been demonstrated in a wide range of concentrations as well. And here's just a diagram of the UV peroxide process. UV peroxide or ozone peroxide generates hydroxyl radicals, which are very effective at breaking the ether link for the 1,4-dioxane, and then additional radicals that are present break the remaining molecule down through that oxidation process, ultimately yielding CO2 and water. And the diagram on the bottom is just a sketch of a UV peroxide system. The peroxide is added up front, some static inline mixers to mix it in, passing the UV lamps, and then you can have some residual treatment, post-treatment with GAC to eliminate any residual peroxide that might be present on the way out. And then the next slide, slide 48, is the ozone peroxide process. Again, this is a long tube with injection of peroxide and ozone and mixers along the way. So it's sort of an incremental treatment through it, and the design aspect of it is understanding what the concentrations are and what the water geochemistry is to know where to inject where to inject the ozone and the peroxide and how much. And then that too has, if there's a residual coming out, either residual peroxide or potentially bromide, naturally occurring bromide can create bromate through this treatment process, and bromate has a 10 microgram per liter MCL, so you have to watch that. But that can be designed and treated and handled in that process. So again, all of these technologies commercially available, widespread, used in a number of sites for 1,4-dioxane, these ex situ treatment. So now going a little bit more on an innovative direction, ex situ bioreactors. These have been used for other contaminants. As Dave mentioned, the attenuation aspects of 1,4-dioxane and the biodegradation aspects have really come to light in the last 10 years or so. A number of microbiological tools have been developed to demonstrate that the conditions are favorable, the proper bacteria are present, and that the process is occurring. And there's even some commercialization of use of these tools by folks like Serum. In general, direct catabolic degradation is favored at higher concentrations. That's, catabolism is where the bacteria gain some energy from that process. At higher concentrations, like Dave said, where there's higher concentrations, you tend to get more attenuation. You have more bugs that are acclimated to that circumstance and are more effective at breaking down 1,4-dioxane. At lower concentrations, there's just not quite as much dioxane, and they haven't evolved quite so much or acclimated, and so in some cases that's a co-metabolic approach where you're in fact feeding bacteria something else, and then they're using that to generate energy, and in that process they kick off enzymes, and those enzymes can break down the dioxane sort of fortuitously. So it's an aerobic process for the most part. There's very little evidence of an anaerobic biodegradation pathway for 1,4-dioxane. And the aerobic biostimulants that have been looked at, a number of petroleum gases, but propane seems to be the right one that stimulates the right enzyme production that's relatively inexpensive and readily available. And these figures are just various dioxane degrading bacteria that have been identified over time. So as far as a biological bioreactor, this is a fairly standard approach. I kind of modified this from some of Paul Hatzinger's ESTCP work under US DoD grants. This actual diagram is intended for NDMA, which also degrades under propane biostimulation. So very similar. You're adding nutrients, the electron donor, the propane, other things, and oxygen to ensure that you have an aerobic situation, goes into the fluidized bed reactor, and then you have clean effluent come out. So this is an on-site destructive approach. Now, bioreactors have been sort of fortuitously operating for 1,4-dioxane, a number of sites like the Lowry landfill here in Denver, which was stimulated more or less with tetrahydrofuran and fortuitously degraded 1,4-dioxane as well. But as far as I'm aware, there aren't any full-scale fluidized bed reactor installations yet related to this process, but there seems like a good idea, and it ought to work. So we present that. So then we'll move on to in situ technologies. I'll go into each of these individually and talk about those. So chemical oxidation, demonstrated technology for chlorinated VOCs, and some of the same chemistries are applicable and work. For 1,4-dioxane, I mentioned that hydroxyl radical chemistry is very effective on 1,4-dioxane. The Fenton's reagent, hydrogen peroxide activated through various processes, iron and other things, as well as activated persulfate, again, alkaline activated or heat or other aspects of activation have been demonstrated. And then permanganate candles is some research by Pat Evans under ESTCP DoD grants. Slow release of but relatively high concentration permanganate has been shown to be effective as well. And these use various oxidation and radical reactions. The drawbacks of these are more or less the drawback with any in situ technology. Distributing materials in the subsurface due to heterogeneity and other things sometimes can be difficult. There are some secondary water quality issues. For instance, sulfate increases when you use persulfate, but there are others as well, and really the sort of unintended consequences of messing with groundwater geochemistry. We've learned a lot over the years about how we can liberate certain things and they're already existing, or create other conditions or situations that might be detrimental. So having to understand that geochemistry is really critical. You're handling with hazardous materials. In some cases, Department of Homeland Security limits how much hydrogen peroxide you can store on a site, things like that. So there's some permitting and other aspects. And also in general, these are short-lived reactions. You activate persulfate, for instance, and you pump it in the ground, and that is a very reactive situation, and all the action happens pretty close to the wells, and to get that to cover a broader area can be sometimes difficult in this with these approaches. So here's a little bit of the chemistry on what happens with sodium persulfate. The activation through either heat or a catalyst or elevated pH breaks that peroxide bond, and you get sulfate radicals as well as sulfate. And then the sulfate radical is an oxidizer in and of itself, but also through other reactions with water can end up generating hydroxyl radicals as well as other superoxides and other products. And that, again, that hydroxyl radical is a very effective degrader of 1,4-dioxane. This is just a kind of a sidebar a little bit. I mentioned about how things are relatively short-lived. If you activate the persulfate and then inject it into the well, you have a highly reactive material, but getting that to migrate very far can be sometimes difficult. This is an example of another approach, which is using the naturally occurring iron and manganese and other minerals in the aquifer can activate sodium persulfate as well. This was a pilot study, and the well this is a specific well that was 650 feet down gradient of the pilot study area, and you can see the sulfate increasing with distance, and we see, which is a measure of how much persulfate was breaking down with time and migrating, and the concentrations degrade relatively rapidly over time, but this was where the persulfate was degrading things while being activated in the aquifer in and of itself. So it can be a way to kind of get a greater distance and greater distribution of that persulfate activity by allowing it to migrate first before being activated. So in situ biodegradation as a technology, this diagram is another one from Paul Hatzinger and Dave Lippencott's work on ESTCP. And this actually is related, again, to NDMA degradation, but it's similar approach, propane and oxygen, creating an aerobic propane co-metabolic biodegradation environment in the subsurface. And one of the key things is that oxygen addition or air addition, because it may be that the biological reactions are oxygen limited, so just injecting propane in the ground may or may not do it. So you have to make sure you maintain an aerobic environment down there as well. And then also, as far as that should have been actually bioaugmentation on that third bullet. My apologies, but bioaugmentation may be required if the correct bacteria are lacking. So in some pilot scale studies that have been done, CB1190 has been injected as an approach to, or as a bacteria to get things started and then biostimulated. So there's been limited full scale or pilot scale projects demonstrating this in situ biodegradation. My understanding is one full-scale project was just implemented at Vandenberg Air Force Base. So that's the first deliberate in situ propane biosparge type system that I'm aware of in the industry. So look forward to those results. The monitored natural attenuation that Dave mentioned, again, there are dioxane degrading bacteria have been found to be much more prevalent than people used to think, and they've been found in a variety of environments. As long as they're aerobic and there's some oxygen available, they've been identified, including in cold climates and equatorial climates as well. So it's kind of likely that aerobic degradation is happening right now, and it's widespread. It just hasn't been looked at. And so the path forward with this is to assemble that weight of evidence, look at the conceptual site model, look at the trends over time, like Dave has. It's excellent work. Mass balance approaches to try to understand whether it's just migrating or degrading. Modeling for sure can apply, as well as geochemical changes, and then biomarkers. And we've talked about some of these biological, these enzymes that can be detected that demonstrate that the conditions are right and that certain bacteria are present. And so this figure here is from some work that worked on at a site in Michigan, and the biomarkers are present in the core plume areas, and they're not really present much outside of the plume or in the low concentration areas quite as much. And the ALDH presence is actually kind of a key element. The DXMO degrader just means that there's a bacteria present that could degrade dioxane, but the ALDH bacteria degrades, or the enzyme, I mean, it is present when the aldehyde is present, and the aldehyde presence is the first breakdown step of 1,4-dioxane from a biological breakdown standpoint. So what the ALDH presence signifies is that dioxane has already been biodegraded one step, and those enzymes and the bacteria that promote those are actively working to take that next step out. So, you know, I have a reference here to the stuff Dave already talked about, but, you know, we see evidence of degradation that's likely to be biological. We have a bunch of tools available that we can now look with, and I do think over time we need to build that database of sites that have proven or demonstrated natural attenuation. I think it's a good, viable direction to go. Phytoremediation, there's been evidence that dioxane, being as miscible and mobile as it is and non-bioaccumulative, it doesn't stick to things very much. And so there's evidence that plants pull it up through the roots and through the trunks and out the leaves, and it transpires out with the soil moisture, or with the moisture out of the leaves. And then in the atmosphere, there's a 7-day half-life estimated based on photooxidation. So we know, and we've seen evidence of it being able to be pulled up into trees, and this could be used kind of as a containment or a dewatering approach. Again, because dioxane is so miscible and mobile, having the trees be those pumps essentially to pull it out is a possibility. Also, there's a lot of biological activity going on and a lot of oxidative activity going on in the root zone. There's been some talk of bioaugmenting in the root zone to do better about breaking things down, but there's a lot of humic acid degradation activities going on, and it may be oxidizing in that root zone anyway. There are some applied engineered wetlands approaches for this, and then this figure here is from Ron Gatliff's work with this tree well concept, where you can actually draw water up from greater depths than typically accessible through phytoremediation, and then the tree then transpires it, takes care of the treatment aspect of it. So it's a pretty novel approach, which has been applied full scale, I understand, as well. And the last in situ technology is thermal treatment. The concept in terms of steam stripping or other heating should work with 1,4-dioxane. This figure is some early sort of bench testing work, and I know Emily Crownover from TRS is speaking at Battelle on 1,4-dioxane thermal treatment. I don't know if she's got newer data. I assume she does, but that's something to watch for. But you know, dioxane's boiling point is very similar to water, so you have to get up to that 100-degree range. But it's an azeotrope, so there's you don't quite have to remove all of the water to remove the dioxane, but you're driving essentially water and dioxane out of the soil more or less at the same time, and then you just have to treat the dioxane coming out in the vapor phase. So again, in situ thermal is a well-demonstrated technology overall. I'm not aware of any full-scale projects, but again, you know, TRS may have those, and we may hear about them at the Battelle conference coming up in late May. But conceptually, it should work fine. So then, just the last slide here, I have the example of some of the things that are happening, and we've got this comprehensive treatability testing program that's going to occur at Arnold Air Force Base, which is the figure there is actually of the wind tunnels and some of the technology that's used at that test facility. But there are a number of sites there that have 1,4-dioxane impacts. There are old sites that had pump and treat with air strippers running for many years for the co-located chlorinated solvents. But now they've discovered 1,4-dioxane, and their discharge is going into surface water, so they have to treat the 1,4-dioxane. And so we'll be basically looking at these different technologies. We've applied these in a number of places in different ways, but what we really need to do is understand the economics and the long-term cost of each of the technologies. And it may be some of them are much lower flow, some are much higher concentration, and it's likely that we may end up with a different answer for each of the three sites. But you know, it'd be nice to have a project that compares the operation of field pilot tested data on multiple systems to try to get down to that idea of what's the most cost effective for a given situation. So we'll see, that's in progress at the moment. And that's it. I'll pass it back to Rick.
Okay, hey, thanks, Bill. We have a few minutes for some questions. We've got a couple questions on the chat page, and one of them I'm directing towards Dave Adamson. Someone asked about, in one of your slides, you showed a 0.59 reduction of dioxane and a 0.9 reduction for TCE. So he's just wondering about the time period of that slide. If you can recall which slide that was and maybe explain it, that'd be great.
Yeah, that was a good question, and I actually had to go look back at the data to make sure I remembered what the value was, but it was a median monitoring period of about 7 years. So those reductions were, you know, over the course of slightly under a decade.
Okay, great. Yeah. I have another question here. It would seem that enhanced in situ bio and M&A would be challenging if you need aerobic conditions. Wouldn't the co-located chlorinated solvents drive the geochemistry towards anaerobic? How do you get around that, Bill?
Yeah, that is a good point. And you know, in general, at chlorinated solvent sites, we inject stuff in the ground, sugars and other things, to drive it anaerobic to get that enhanced reductive geochemistry to work. So at many sites, they are oxic, and by that I mean just slightly aerobic. You don't need DO to be that high to allow aerobic conditions for the bacteria to thrive. But that is, it's a challenge if there's a lot of chlorinated solvents and that organic matter has already driven it anaerobic or co-located petroleum. But then it's an even more challenge if we've already gone in and driven it by injecting thousands of gallons of sugar in the ground, and now we've got this fully anaerobic chlorinated solution in the ground, and we have to kind of wait for that to migrate down gradient, or you could inject oxygen and other things in there to make it aerobic. So that is definitely a challenge, the fact that those are on different ends of that biological spectrum, which does kind of favor, in a co-located chlorinated and dioxane plume, an oxidative approach is a little bit favored because it can handle both sets of compounds.
Okay, great. We still have some time. If you want to send a question in on the chat, that'd be great, because we open up the lines to everybody. I think the noise will be a little bit overwhelming for everyone. But I have a question to ask of Dr. Anderson. So we know there's toxicity. We know states are coming out with their own MCLs. And we all know that PFAS is the giant elephant in the room. Do you foresee any movement or action by US EPA to possibly consider an MCL for 1,4-dioxane?
First of all, can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Good. Well, I mean, my crystal ball's not working at the moment, and it's always hard to anticipate or try to figure out exactly what EPA is doing. Their actions related to 1,4-dioxane under TSCA are moving forward. 1,4-dioxane's been on their priority list for that. And what's interesting is the toxicity evaluation is slightly different from the older stuff. So my guess is the short answer is likely no, not in the immediate future. I think the states are going to continue to move ahead. For example, New York just reissued their proposed rulemaking for an MCL for 1,4-dioxane. So I think the states will continue to move ahead. I think the EPA will continue to address 1,4-dioxane under TSCA in the time being.
I guess I have a follow-up question for David. So I understand that the US EPA and the Safe Drinking Water Act is going to modify the UCMR requirements, and they're going to monitor a lot more water systems in the next few years than the 10,000 users right now. I guess you'd probably anticipate that would increase the numbers of dots and hits for 1,4-dioxane in public water supplies across the U.S.?
Well, in theory, you would think it would, except that UCMR3 includes all large systems and a subset of small systems. And we saw that the detection frequency in small systems was pretty low compared to those large systems. So if EPA is going to add a bunch of small systems, it's going to move the needle, but it's not going to move the needle as much as you might think. They've already, I think, captured the major issues in terms of sort of the total overall population. Now, you could argue that every small system is a bigger challenge because it's, you know, a small water supplier doesn't have the resources or whatever to potentially deal with a problem. But in terms of thinking about the scale of the problem, the current data are pretty good. They can always be better, but I think they're helping us get a handle on it.
Okay. I didn't get any more questions on the chat. Do any of our presenters have a question for each other they might want to ask?
Actually, yeah, I had one for Janet as well. I was curious, you know, again, with the uncertainty on the whole PFAS thing, there's a lot of research happening right now on PFAS toxicology, and it's obviously way more complicated because of the number of compounds. But are you aware of sort of active toxicological assessments or epidemiological assessments for dioxane to try to firm up the data that's out there, or is everybody who's moving forward on the existing data and that's it?
No, that's a great question. I'm not aware of any epidemiology studies. I just don't think that the exposure levels are high enough to get the span of concentrations or exposure populations that you'll need to do a robust study. In the animal research world, in the hypothesis testing where we can control exposures, there are some continuing work to try to better understand that question of how 1,4-dioxane causes cancer, and the correct way or the more scientifically valid way of modeling that cancer risk in all the different types of cancers that 1,4-dioxane may show. So in the rodents, 1,4-dioxane causes cancer in the liver and in the kidneys, and then there's also some indications of some nasal problems in the nasal respiratory tract. And so the question is, does 1,4-dioxane act the same in all of those different tissues or not? And would it act the same in all, in humans as well? So there is ongoing work there.
Okay. So we're getting close to the end, and 1,4-dioxane is definitely getting more attention at the state level. And as we see, ITRC does have a team addressing the issue. So when they have a team, it usually means things will be happening and there'll be a lot more questions about things. With that, I'd like to advance. If someone who's got control can advance to the closing slides, I'll do that. I think, Bill, you have the last control of that, or there's a couple of closers?
Yep. I just pushed it to the end. It's on the upcoming events.
Okay, I've got like a 5 to 10. I got a pretty good lag here on my internet connection. So maybe you want to read it off, Bill, because I can't see it. I just see it.
Sure, that's fine. There are a couple other upcoming events of interest to this group, perhaps from Society of American Military Engineers. One of them, there's a number of there's some DoD briefings that'll be occurring in mid-March in Bethesda, Maryland. The other is the JETSI, the Joint Engineering Training Conference, the 2020 version of that in DC in late May. There is an environmental track. As you might guess, there's a bunch of PFAS in it, but that's not all. There's some other aspects of environmental that do exist, even though it doesn't seem that way anymore. So the track is covering a pretty good range of those technical talks. So we invite everybody to learn about that on the SAME webpage and attend those things.
Yes,
and
just to
this is Rick.
speak briefly on that, DoD briefings registration is open. So if you want to go head over to SAME capital or capweek.org and go ahead and check out the sessions that are listed and register on that website. Also, 2020 JETSI registration will be opening at the end of next week. But you can go ahead and go over to the SAMEJETC.org website and just check out some of the things that are happening. The schedule is up for that week, so just a heads up.
Okay. Well, this is Rick Wice, and I'm the incoming chair for the Environmental Community of Interest for SAME, and I welcome all you participants today. You've got in the slides here my email if you're interested or want to know more information about the COI. As Bill said, we have a very robust environmental track for JETSI. It is not all PFAS. There'll be a little bit of some stratigraphy, other remediation technologies, some compliance issues. We will have Maureen Sullivan leading 2 panels on PFAS, so it is a major concern for DoD, and that's the community we work with. So feel free to contact me directly. Go to the SAME webpage. We look forward to your involvement and interest in the COI. And with that, I want to thank our presenters once again, Dr. Janet Anderson, Dr. David Adamson, and Bill DiGuiseppi, professional geologist from Jacobs, for their efforts today in presentations, and for everyone who spent time this afternoon from their workday to participate and listen in on this webinar. So with that, I'm going to close it, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.